A couple walked toward table 5 with their coats still on, and I stepped in front of the chairs before either of them could sit down. I told them, as politely as I could manage, that they could not sit there. My manager crossed the dining room fast, asking me what exactly I thought I was doing, turning away a party at an empty table. I did not have a clean answer. Seconds later, nobody standing in that room was arguing with me anymore. Every story on this channel is about someone who noticed something before anyone else could and paid for it before anyone believed them. If that sounds familiar, hit subscribe because there is a new one every week. Here is how that night actually started. My name is Marissa Coyle, and at that point, I had only just started at a restaurant called Halvern House, a mid-sized place with a stone facade and dark wood booths that sat on the corner of a street busy enough to keep the dining room full most nights of the week. The manager was a woman named Denise Fairfax, someone who had run that floor for 11 years and who everybody, including the owner, deferred to on anything having to do with seating, staffing, or the layout of the room. Denise was not the kind of person who raised her voice, and she was not the kind of person who made a decision without a reason behind it. That is important to understand before anything else, because what happened at table 5 only makes sense if you understand that Denise was never wrong for foolish reasons. She was wrong that night for reasons that made complete sense at the time, and I want to be fair to her about that from the very beginning. Table 5 sat against the far wall of the dining room, tucked slightly beneath an archway that separated the main floor from a smaller side room used mostly for private parties. It was one of the better tables in the restaurant, close enough to the window to get natural light during the day, far enough from the kitchen doors to avoid the noise, and large enough to comfortably seat 4 people without anyone feeling crowded. On a night like the one I am describing, with the dining room close to full and a line already starting to form near the host stand, an open 4-top table like that was not something any manager wanted sitting empty for even 5 minutes. I had noticed something about that table 3 nights earlier on only my second shift, though at the time I did not think much of it. I had been carrying a tray of water glasses past the archway when I felt something under my shoe that did not feel right. A kind of give in the floor that was small, almost nothing, the sort of thing a person could walk over 100 times without registering it consciously. I remember pausing for half a second, glancing down at the floor, seeing nothing unusual, and continuing on with the tray, because the dining room was busy and there was no time to stand around examining a floorboard. I did not mention it to anyone. I barely mentioned it to myself. The second thing happened the following night, my third shift, when I was refilling the water pitcher station that sat just behind table 5, against the wall beneath the archway. While I was standing there, I heard a sound, faint, almost underneath the general noise of the dining room, a kind of low creak that repeated itself every few seconds, not loud enough that anyone eating at the table would notice it over their own conversation, but steady enough that once I heard it the first time, I kept hearing it every time I stood near that spot. I told myself it was probably the building settling, the way older buildings do, especially ones with stone exteriors and wood interiors that had likely been renovated more than once over the years. Halvern House had been there, according to one of the other servers, for almost 60 years, which meant plenty of time for a building to develop the sorts of small sounds and small settlings that nobody pays attention to until something forces them to. The third thing, and the thing that finally made me start paying real attention, happened only 2 nights before the night with the couple and their coats. I was clearing table 5 after a party of 4 had finished their meal, and as I bent down to pick up a napkin that had fallen near the base of the table, I noticed a very faint line running along the wall just below the archway, close to the floor, thin enough that I might not have seen it at all if the afternoon light coming through the front windows had not been hitting that exact section of wall at that exact moment. It was not a crack in the traditional sense, not the kind of jagged line you would picture on a damaged wall. It was smoother than that, almost like a seam running horizontally for about 2 feet before curving slightly upward toward the corner of the archway. I ran my finger along it out of simple curiosity and felt that the wall on one side of the line sat very slightly higher than the wall on the other side, a difference so small that measuring it would have required more than my finger, but a difference that was there nonetheless. I did not say anything to Denise about any of this, not the floor, not the sound, not the seam in the wall, because I did not have anything close to a real explanation, and I did not want to be the new girl who walked up to the manager on her 3rd or 4th shift with a story about a floor that felt slightly soft and a wall that had a seam in it. Restaurants are old buildings sometimes. Old buildings creak and settle and develop lines in their plaster. I told myself that every one of those observations, taken on its own, meant nothing at all, and for 2 more nights, I managed to convince myself of that every single time I walked past table 5 with a tray in my hands. What changed everything was the afternoon before the night with the couple, during the restaurant slow period between lunch and dinner service, when most of the staff was either on break or doing prep work in the back. I had gone to the side room near table 5 to restock a supply closet that the servers used for extra napkins and silverware, and while I was in there, alone, with the dining room mostly empty and quiet, I heard the creaking sound again, except this time it was not the same faint, occasional sound I had heard before. It was closer to a groan, low and drawn out, coming from somewhere above and slightly behind the archway, lasting almost 3 full seconds before it stopped. I stood completely still in that supply closet with a stack of napkins in my hands, and I felt something I can only describe as a kind of cold certainty settle into my chest, even though I still did not have a single fact that would have explained itself out loud to another person. I did not know what was wrong. I only knew, in a way I could not yet defend, that something was wrong, specifically at that archway, specifically above that table. I walked out of the supply closet and stood at the edge of the dining room, looking at table 5 from a distance, the way you might look at a photograph and try to notice the thing sitting slightly out of place. The table looked completely normal, 4 clean chairs pushed neatly against it, silverware already set for the evening service, a small vase of flowers in the center, exactly like the ones on every other table in the room. Nothing about it looked wrong, and yet standing there, looking at it, I felt the same certainty I had felt in the supply closet, stronger now, settling into something closer to a decision than a suspicion. I did not have time to think through what to do about it, because at that exact moment, Denise came out of the office at the back of the restaurant, walking briskly toward the host's stand with a reservation book under her arm, already calling out instructions to the host about a party that had just called to move their reservation earlier by 20 minutes. The dining room was about to open for the evening rush, and within the hour, table 5 would be seated, cleared, and seated again, over and over, the way every table in a busy restaurant is, all night long, without anyone standing there long enough to notice a sound coming from somewhere above an archway that most people would never even think to listen for. I had maybe 40 minutes before the doors opened to figure out what I actually believed was happening, and even less time than that to decide what, if anything, I was going to do about it. I spent the next few minutes doing something I probably should have done 3 nights earlier, which was actually looking, on purpose, at everything around table 5 instead of only noticing things by accident while my hands were full of water glasses or napkins. I walked to the archway and stood beneath it, tilting my head back to look up at the ceiling, though from that angle there was nothing to see except the same clean white paint that covered every ceiling in the dining room. I ran my hand along the wall near the seam I had noticed 2 nights before, and in the better light of late afternoon, I could see it more clearly than I had before, a thin, smooth line running for roughly 2 feet before curving upward into the corner where the archway met the wall. I did not know anything about construction. I did not know anything about old buildings or foundations or what a seam like that could mean if it meant anything at all. What I did know, standing there with my hand still resting against the wall, was that 3 separate things on 3 separate days had all pointed toward the exact same small section of the dining room, and I did not believe in coincidences that lined up that neatly, even though I also did not have a single fact I could have written down on a piece of paper and handed to someone else as proof. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Denise walking toward the archway, still holding the reservation book, glancing at her watch the way she always did in the final stretch before the doors opened. She was not looking at me with any particular concern, only the ordinary awareness of a manager checking that every part of her dining room was ready for the evening. When she saw me standing beneath the archway with my hand against the wall, she slowed down, her expression shifting into something curious rather than alarmed. "Everything okay over here?" she asked, and I could hear in her tone that she expected the answer to be yes, because there was no reason at that point for the answer to be anything else. The dining room looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. Table 5 looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. I was simply a new server standing near a wall for no obvious reason, and Denise, being reasonable, was giving me every chance to explain myself in some simple, forgettable way. I did not know how to answer her honestly without sounding strange, and I did not want to lie, so I told her the truth in the smallest possible version I could manage. I said that I had noticed a sound near the archway a few times over the past several days, a kind of creaking, and that I had also noticed a thin line in the wall that seemed like it might not have always been there. I said it carefully, watching her face the entire time, trying to read whether she was taking it seriously or simply being polite, while she waited for me to finish so she could get back to preparing for the dinner rush. Denise walked closer to the wall herself and crouched down slightly, running her own fingers along the same seam I had shown her. She was quiet for a moment, and I remember feeling a small flicker of hope that she might see exactly what I had seen, that she might feel the same cold certainty I had felt standing in the supply closet less than an hour earlier. But when she stood back up, her expression had settled into something calm and practical rather than concerned. "This building is almost 60 years old," she said, not unkindly, more like someone explaining something she had explained before. "Old plaster does this. It settles, it shifts a little with the seasons, especially with the heat coming on for the first time this month. I have seen lines like this in half the walls in this restaurant over the years. It does not mean anything is wrong." She said it the way a person says something they genuinely believe, not the way a person says something to dismiss another person quickly so they can move on to something else. I understood, even as she was saying it, that she was not brushing me off out of impatience. She had run this restaurant for 11 years. She had almost certainly seen more strange sounds and small cosmetic cracks in that building than I would see in the rest of my life, and every single one of them had turned out to be nothing. That was the first time I understood, clearly, the second rule this channel is built on, even though, of course, I did not think of it in those words at the time. Denise was not wrong because she was careless, or because she did not care about her staff or her restaurant. She was wrong because she had 11 years of experience telling her, correctly almost every time, that old buildings make old building sound, and that a person with less than 1 week on the job pointing at a wall was not, statistically, more likely to be right than she was. If I had been standing in her position, with her knowledge and her history in that building, I believe I would have said the exact same thing to me that she said. I understand, I told her, and I meant it, even as some other part of me refused to let go of what I had felt standing beneath that archway less than an hour before. Denise gave me a small, reassuring smile, the kind meant to close a conversation gently, and walked back toward the host stand to finish preparing for the evening. I stood there for another moment, alone again beneath the archway, looking at table 5, at the clean chairs and the small vase of flowers, and I made a decision that I did not fully understand myself until much later that night. I decided that if I could not explain in words why I did not trust that table, I could still choose not to seat anyone at it. At least not yet. At least not until I understood more. The doors opened at 5 o'clock, and within 20 minutes, the dining room was moving at the pace it always moved. During a Friday evening service, servers weaving between tables, the kitchen calling out ticket numbers, the host seating parties as fast as the room would allow. I was assigned to a section that included table 5, along with 3 other tables near the archway, which meant that responsibility for seating that table, at least in the ordinary flow of the evening, would fall partly to me and partly to the host stand, depending on how the room filled up. For the first hour, I managed to avoid the problem entirely, because the room simply had not filled up enough yet to need table 5. I served 2 other tables in my section, took drink orders, delivered appetizers, did the ordinary work of a Friday night shift while keeping one eye, almost without meaning to, on the archway and the table sitting beneath it. Every few minutes I found myself glancing toward it, half expecting to see or hear something, though nothing happened. The dining room simply continued the way it always did, loud and warm and full of the clatter of silverware and the low hum of 40 different conversations happening at once. At around 6:15, the host, a young man named Trevor, who had been working at Halvern House for close to 2 years, walked toward table 5 with a party of 2, a middle-aged couple who had just walked in without a reservation and asked for the first available table. I saw them coming before Trevor even reached the archway, and I felt that same cold certainty rise up in my chest again, sharper this time, urgent in a way it had not been earlier in the day when the dining room was empty and quiet. I moved quickly, cutting across the floor faster than I probably should have, and reached the archway just seconds before Trevor and the couple did. I did not have a plan. I did not have a sentence prepared. I only knew that I could not let 2 people sit down at that table. Not yet. Not until I understood what I had been feeling for the better part of a week. "I am so sorry," I said, stepping slightly in front of the chairs, keeping my voice as calm and polite as I could manage, even though my pulse was moving faster than I wanted it to. "This table is actually not available right now. Let me find you something else." Trevor looked at me with obvious confusion, glancing down at his seating chart, which clearly showed table 5 as open, and the couple looked between the 2 of us, clearly uncertain about what was happening in front of them. I could see Trevor start to say something, probably to correct me, probably to point out that the table was, according to every record he had, completely available. It was at that exact moment, before Trevor could finish his sentence, that Denise appeared from across the dining room, moving fast, her eyes already narrowing in the particular way a manager's eyes narrow when they sense a problem developing in the middle of a service they are responsible for keeping smooth. She crossed the floor in a matter of seconds, and I remember watching her approach and feeling, for the first time all night, something closer to fear than certainty, because I understood, watching her face, that I was about to be asked a question I still did not have a good enough answer for. "Marissa," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to carry over the noise of the dining room, "what exactly is going on over here?" I opened my mouth to answer her, and in that half second, before any words came out, I felt the full weight of everything I did not know. I did not know what was wrong with that wall. I did not know what the sound meant. I did not know if I was about to lose the only job I had managed to get after weeks of searching, or if I was about to look like a foolish new employee who had let a strange feeling override a simple, ordinary seating decision on one of the busiest nights of the week. I looked past Denise, at the couple still standing there with their coats still on, waiting, and then at the archway above table 5, and something in me refused to move out of the way. "I do not have a good explanation," I said to Denise, keeping my voice as steady as I could, though I could feel my hands wanting to shake, and I kept them still by pressing my fingers lightly against the small notepad in my apron pocket. "I know how that sounds. I know there is nothing on paper that says this table is not safe, but I am asking you to trust me for just a few minutes and seat this couple somewhere else while I explain." Denise did not answer right away. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that was not angry so much as searching, the look of someone trying to decide whether the person in front of her was overreacting to nothing or reacting for the first time to something real. Around us, I was aware of the dining room continuing at its normal volume, servers moving past with trays, the couple still standing there, growing visibly less patient with every second that passed, without an explanation. A few nearby tables had noticed the small commotion near the archway and were glancing over, the way people always glance toward the edges of a disagreement, even when they cannot hear the words being said. "Marissa, this is table 5, Denise said, lowering her voice further, clearly trying to keep the conversation between the two of us, rather than turning it into a spectacle in front of a full dining room. "It is a perfectly good table. We talked about this exact spot only a few hours ago, and I told you then, this building is old, and old buildings creak. I cannot have you turning away paying customers on a Friday night because of a sound." She was not shouting. She was not humiliating me in front of anyone. She was doing exactly what a responsible manager does when an employee makes a decision that, from where she was standing, looked completely unjustified, which was to correct it quickly, calmly, and privately before it affected the rest of the service. "I understand why it looks like that," I said. "I would think the same thing if I were you, but it has not just been a sound. There was something in the floor 3 nights ago, right under this archway, that gave slightly under my foot. There was the line in the wall we looked at earlier today, and an hour before the doors opened, I heard that same sound again, except longer and louder than before, coming from somewhere above where we are standing right now." I gestured slightly upward, toward the ceiling above the archway, though there was nothing visible there to point to. "I am not asking you to believe me because I have proof. I do not have proof. I am asking you to give me 10 minutes to find someone who can actually look at this properly, and in the meantime, seat this table somewhere else." Denise glanced at the couple, who were now shifting their weight impatiently, and then back at me. I could see her running through the calculations that 11 years of managing a restaurant had trained her to run through almost automatically: a full dining room, a line at the host stand, a new employee, less than a week into the job, refusing to seat a completely ordinary-looking table over a feeling she could not fully explain. Every piece of evidence she had, every year of experience she had accumulated, pointed toward the same conclusion, which was that I was wrong, and that the responsible thing to do for the sake of the couple waiting and the dining room behind them, was to override me and move forward with seating the table the way it had been seated 1,000 times before, without incident. "I am going to seat this couple at table 5, Denise said, and her tone made it clear this was not a question. "And Marissa, I need you to either get back to your section or we are going to need to have a longer conversation about tonight after service." She said it evenly, without cruelty, the way a manager says something she genuinely believes is fair, because from her perspective, it was fair. She was not trying to punish me. She was trying to run a restaurant on a busy night, and everything in front of her said that the table was safe. I felt something tighten in my chest, not quite panic, but close to it. The particular tightness that comes from knowing you are about to lose an argument you cannot afford to lose, for reasons you cannot fully put into words. I thought about the floor giving slightly under my shoe. I thought about the seam in the wall, smooth and precise, running along that exact section beneath the archway. I thought about the sound in the supply closet, low and drawn out, lasting 3 full seconds, longer than anything I had heard from that spot before. None of it, laid out individually, would have convinced a stranger of anything. But standing there, feeling all 3 of those small observations stacked on top of each other in my mind, I could not make myself step aside. "Please," I said, and I heard my own voice crack slightly on the word, not from weakness, but from the effort of trying to convince someone of something using nothing but conviction. "Just 10 minutes. If nothing is wrong, I will apologize to this couple myself, and I will take responsibility for whatever you decide after that. But if I am right, 10 minutes is going to matter a great deal more than it seems like it should right now." Denise studied me for another long moment. I could see something shift slightly in her expression, not quite belief, but a kind of hesitation, the smallest possible crack in her certainty. 11 years of experience told her that new employees do not usually behave this way over nothing, that panic over an actual problem and stubbornness over an imagined one tend to look different up close, even when they sound similar from a distance. Still, hesitation was not the same as agreement, and the dining room was not going to wait patiently while the 2 of us worked through it. "Fine," she said finally, though her voice carried none of the relief I felt hearing it. 10 minutes. I am seating this couple at table 11 instead, and you are going to go find Marcus in the back and ask him to come take a look at this wall, because if there really is a problem, he is the only one on staff tonight who would know what he is looking at. Marcus, I would learn a few minutes later, was the restaurant's longtime maintenance contractor, a man who had handled every repair and renovation at Halvern House for close to 15 years, and who happened, by simple luck, to be in the building that night, finishing up an unrelated plumbing job in the kitchen. I do not think I said thank you clearly enough in that moment, because I was already moving, weaving through the dining room toward the kitchen, my heart pounding harder than it had all night, not from fear anymore, but from the narrow, fragile hope that I had just been given 10 minutes to prove something I still could not have explained if anyone had stopped me and asked me to explain it properly. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I have wondered about this a lot since that night. Have you ever had a moment where the people around you were not being unreasonable at all, where you could see clearly that anyone standing in their position would have made the exact same decision they were making, and yet you still could not force yourself to go along with it? Tell me in the comments if you have been there, because I think it is a stranger, lonelier feeling than people give it credit for. I found Marcus near the back of the kitchen, kneeling beside an open panel under the prep sink, a toolbox open beside him, and a headlamp strapped across his forehead, even though the overhead lights in the kitchen were more than bright enough to work by. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the kind of quiet, unhurried manner that comes from decades of fixing things that other people considered emergencies, but that he, from experience, usually did not. "Marcus, I am sorry to bother you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite how quickly I had crossed the restaurant to find him. "But Denise asked if you could come look at something near table 5. There is a sound coming from above the archway, and there is a seam in the wall that might not have always been there." Marcus looked up at me slowly, wiping his hands on a rag before standing, and for a moment I was afraid he was going to give me the same reasonable, practical answer Denise had given me earlier, that old buildings make old building noises, and that a hairline seam in 60-year-old plaster meant nothing at all. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, his expression shifting into something more thoughtful than dismissive. "Above the archway, near table 5, he repeated, almost to himself, as though the location meant something specific to him that it had not meant to anyone else all night. "That is close to where the old service stairwell used to run, before they closed it off during the renovation about 20 years back. There is a support beam up there that carries more weight than people would guess." Looking at it from the dining room, he picked up a small flashlight from his toolbox and gestured for me to lead the way. And as we walked back through the kitchen doors toward the dining room, I felt for the first time all night that the cold certainty sitting in my chest might finally be about to meet something solid enough to explain it. We walked back out into the dining room together, Marcus moving with the same unhurried calm he had shown in the kitchen, which somehow made the moment feel both less frightening and more serious at the same time. I noticed that Denise had already reseated the couple at table 11, and though I could see her watching us from near the host stand, she did not come over right away, giving Marcus room to work without an audience gathering around him. Marcus stopped beneath the archway and looked up first, tilting his flashlight toward the ceiling, running the beam slowly along the plaster where it met the top of the archway. He was quiet for a long moment, and I stood beside him, holding my breath without meaning to, watching his face for any sign of what he was seeing. "Can you feel where the floor gave under your foot?" he asked me, without looking away from the ceiling. "Show me exactly where." I walked to the spot, close to the base of the archway, and pressed my foot down gently where I remembered the give happening 3 nights before. Marcus crouched down beside me and pressed his own hand flat against the floor in the same spot, then moved it a few inches in each direction, testing the surface carefully. He nodded slowly, more to himself than to me, and stood back up, this time walking to the wall and running his fingers along the seam I had shown Denise earlier that afternoon. "This building went through a renovation about 20 years ago," Marcus said, finally turning to face me directly. "Before that, there used to be a service stairwell right here, connecting the main dining room to a lower storage level that used to be a wine cellar, back when this place operated under different ownership. When they renovated, they closed the stairwell off, filled it in, and built the archway and this section of flooring on top of where the old stairwell opening used to be." He paused, glancing back up at the ceiling. "The load-bearing support for that section was never meant to carry the weight it is carrying now, not on its own, not without the original stairwell structure underneath it, helping distribute things the way it used to." I felt something settle in my stomach, a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief because for the first time all night, someone with real knowledge was confirming that what I had felt was not simply nerves or imagination, and fear because the confirmation meant that something was genuinely wrong, not with a chair or a napkin or something easily fixed, but with the actual structure of the room I had been standing in every single night for the past week. "The sound you heard," Marcus continued, "the creaking, especially if it got longer and lower over the past few days, that is very likely the support beam above this archway responding to stress. Probably from the added weight of the walk-in refrigeration unit they installed upstairs in the private party room a few months back. Nobody who installed that refrigeration unit would have known about the old stairwell underneath because it was filled in and sealed decades before that unit ever went in. On paper, that upstairs room looks like ordinary floor space, capable of holding ordinary weight. In reality, it is sitting almost directly above a section of ceiling that was never reinforced to carry that kind of extra load over an extended period of time. He knelt down again near the base of the archway and pressed his flashlight beam directly into the seam in the wall, angling it so that the light caught the very slight difference in height between the two sides of the plaster that I had noticed 2 nights earlier. "This seam is not settling," he said. "Settling happens slowly, over years, in a fairly uniform way across a wall. This is localized, and if I had to guess without opening anything up yet, I would say this section of wall and ceiling has shifted more in the past few months than it has in the previous 15 years combined. The floor giving slightly under your foot right in this spot tells me the same story. Something above us has been slowly failing, and it has been accelerating." Denise had come over while Marcus was speaking, standing a few feet behind us, arms crossed, listening with an expression that had shifted from the calm authority she carried earlier into something more careful, more alert. When Marcus finished speaking, she looked at him directly and asked the question I imagined she had been holding back out of professional discipline for the past several minutes. "Marcus, are you telling me this ceiling is actually at risk of coming down?" Marcus did not answer immediately, which somehow felt worse than if he had simply said yes right away. He stood up slowly, brushing off his knees, and looked up one more time at the ceiling above the archway before answering. "I am telling you that I would not seat anyone under this archway again until I have opened up that ceiling and looked at the beam directly. I could be wrong about how urgent this is, but everything you have both described to me, the sound, the seam, the floor, all of it points toward a support structure that has been failing quietly for a while now. And structural failures like that do not always give a long warning before they become a real problem. Sometimes they creak for weeks. Sometimes the last sound they make before something actually happens is barely different from all the sounds before it." I remember standing there, listening to him say that, and feeling the full weight of what I had almost allowed to happen settle over me all at once. If I had not stepped in front of those chairs less than 20 minutes earlier, that couple would have been sitting directly beneath that archway, at that exact table, for the better part of an hour, eating dinner, having no idea that the ceiling above their heads had been slowly, quietly giving way for months, accelerated by a piece of equipment installed in a room they would never even see, resting on a structure that had been sealed away and forgotten for 20 years. Denise was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her face carefully, unsure of what to expect. I did not expect an apology, not immediately, not in the middle of a dinner service with the dining room still full of customers who had no idea any of this was happening only a few feet away from their meals. What I saw instead was something more complicated, a kind of visible recalculation happening behind her eyes, the look of someone going back through a decision she had made only minutes earlier and understanding in real time how close that decision had come to going very differently. "I need this area roped off immediately," Denise said, turning to Marcus, her voice shifting instantly into the brisk, efficient tone of someone managing a genuine emergency rather than a seating disagreement. "And I need you to tell me honestly whether we need to clear anyone currently seated near the section of the dining room." Marcus glanced toward the tables closest to the archway, calculating something silently. then nodded. The 2 tables directly adjacent, yes, just as a precaution, until I can get eyes on that beam properly tomorrow morning with better light and the right equipment. Everything else in the dining room should be far enough away to be fine tonight, but nobody sits under this archway again until I say otherwise. What followed was one of the strangest 20 minutes I have ever experienced during a restaurant shift. Watching Denise personally walk 2 occupied tables through a calm, practical explanation involving vague language about routine maintenance, watching her comp both tables, a round of desserts for the inconvenience, watching the dining room continue almost seamlessly around a small, quiet crisis that most of the customers in the room never even noticed was happening. Table 5 sat empty for the rest of the night, along with the 2 tables beside it, a small dead zone in an otherwise full dining room, roped off with a simple stanchion Trevor brought over from the host stand. No explanation offered to anyone beyond the occasional polite word about maintenance work. I did not get to speak with Denise again properly until much later that night, after the dining room had cleared out and the last tables had been bussed, and the kitchen had begun its closing routine. I was restocking the water station near the host stand when she walked over, no longer wearing the brisk, managing expression she had carried through the rest of the service, but something quieter, more tired, more thoughtful. "I owe you an apology," she said, and I started to tell her that she did not, that I understood completely why she had made the decision she made, but she held up a hand gently to stop me before I could finish. "No, listen to me. I have run this floor for 11 years, and in 11 years, I have learned to trust experience over instinct, because 99 times out of 100, experience is right, and instinct from a new employee, however sincere, is usually just nerves. Tonight, it was not. Tonight, you were right about something I would never have caught on my own, and you were right about it using nothing but a feeling you could not fully explain, even to yourself. I do not know what to do with that except to tell you that I was wrong to push back the way I did, and that I am grateful you did not simply step aside when I asked you to." I did not know how to respond to that, standing there with a stack of clean napkins in my hands, so I said the only honest thing I could think of, which was that I would not have been able to explain it to anyone either if she had asked me to justify it with anything more than a feeling, until Marcus had put words to what I had only been sensing. Marcus came back the following morning before the restaurant opened, this time with proper equipment and 2 other men from his crew, and it took them most of the day to open up the section of ceiling above the archway and get a real look at what had been happening up there. I was not scheduled to work that day, but Denise called me around 6 in the evening, before I had even started getting ready for my shift the next morning, and asked if I wanted to come in and see what they had found, since I was, in her words, the reason anyone had looked at all. When I arrived, the archway area was still roped off, though the dining room around it had gone back to functioning normally. Tables full, servers moving back and forth, nothing about the rest of the restaurant suggesting that anything unusual had happened there less than 24 hours earlier. Marcus met me near the host stand and walked me back to the archway himself, where a section of the ceiling had been opened up, exposing the wooden framework above. He pointed his flashlight up into the opening, and I could see, even without any real knowledge of construction, that something was clearly wrong. One of the main support beams running above the archway had a long, deep split running nearly its entire length, dark with age along the edges, but noticeably lighter and rougher where the crack had clearly grown wider in more recent months. Beneath it, a secondary support that had been added at some point during the original renovation, likely never intended as a permanent load-bearing piece, was bowed downward under a weight It had clearly not been designed to carry over the long term. This beam has been carrying almost double what it was rated for since that refrigeration unit went in upstairs, Marcus said, tracing the split with the beam of his flashlight. Best guess, based on how far this crack has traveled and how much moisture has gotten into it, this had maybe another few weeks left in it, possibly less, before it would have failed outright. When something like this finally goes, it does not creak politely and wait for you to notice. It goes all at once. I stood there looking up into that opening in the ceiling, at the long, dark split running through solid wood that had been holding steady for decades before something changed above it that nobody could see from the dining room floor, and I thought about how close that couple had come to sitting directly beneath it, coats still on, ordering their meal, having no idea that a structure built 20 years before either of them had likely ever walked into that restaurant was quietly running out of time exactly above their table. I thought about how easily the entire night could have gone differently if I had simply stepped aside when Denise first asked me to, the way almost anyone in my position on their 4th day at a new job would have been reasonably expected to do. Denise had walked over while Marcus was showing me the beam, and she stood beside me for a while, looking up at the same crack, quiet, in a way that felt different from her usual quiet. "The building inspector is coming by tomorrow morning," she said eventually. "Marcus says this is going to mean closing this section of the dining room for at least 2 weeks while they replace the beam properly and reinforce everything else nearby that might have been affected the same way. It is going to be expensive, and it is going to be a headache, and none of it would have happened if you had not stopped that couple from sitting down last night." Word of what had happened traveled through the rest of the staff faster than I expected it to, not because anyone made an announcement about it, but because restaurants are small, tightly connected places where a story like that does not stay quiet for long. Over the following days, I noticed something subtle shift in the way people treated me on the floor. Nothing dramatic, no fanfare, no special recognition in front of customers. Exactly the way I imagined Denise would have wanted it handled. Quiet, professional, no scene made out of something that had, in the end, only worked out because I happened to be standing in the right place at the right time, paying attention to something small enough that almost anyone else would have walked past it without a second thought. Denise never brought it up again in any big way after that first conversation the night of the discovery, but I noticed, over the following weeks, that she started asking my opinion on small things around the dining room that she had never asked a new server about before, whether a table felt too close to a walkway, whether a certain corner of the floor seemed like it needed attention, small, practical questions that had nothing to do with the beam directly, but everything to do with the fact that she had started, quietly, to trust the way I paid attention to the room. The construction crew finished the repair almost exactly on schedule, and when Table 5 went back into service 3 weeks later, freshly painted, the archway reinforced with a beam thick enough that Marcus joked it could probably hold up the roof of a much larger building. I asked Denise if I could be the one to seat the first party there. She agreed without hesitation, and I remember walking a young couple toward that table on a quiet Tuesday evening, watching them sit down, coats coming off this time instead of staying on, completely unaware of everything that table had almost been the site of only a few weeks earlier. I stood there for just a moment longer than I needed to, looking up at the freshly painted ceiling above the archway, solid and quiet now, in a way it had not been quiet before, and something about that small, ordinary moment felt like the actual ending of the story more than anything Denise had said to me that first night. If you have ever noticed something small that everyone around you was ready to explain away, Something you could feel more clearly than you could ever have argued out loud. I would genuinely like to hear about it, so tell me what it was down below. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, stories about people who saw something before anyone else could and held their ground anyway, hit subscribe now because there is another one of these waiting for you next week, and I have a feeling you are going to want to be there for it.